So could I go around the room for any questions for Lucas, please? And I'll take your questions and then we'll feed them in with this general set of questions which come through for Lucas. Any questions for Lucas? Any for Teresa? Yes, please.
There was a big tax reform in the U.S. December 2017. So we now have a territorial income tax. We have the third from the bottom in the OECD in terms of tax rates, and they gave multinationals that had parked all this money offshore 8 years to repatriate. They don't have to actually repatriate so long as they pay the tax, but they have 8 years to pay the tax. So anyway, that's an important qualification to your findings. And just you should take that into account, I think.
Thanks. This is, of course, Jim Henry, whom many of you know, but am I right? Yeah. For a second, you looked a little bit surprised, and I thought, oh, have I got the wrong person? Yeah. But for the rest of you, if you wouldn't mind specifying your name before we go into the questions so that we know who you are, which institution you're from. Jim, thanks for that comment. Any specific questions for Teresa? Okay. For Lucas.
Many thanks for your presentation. It was really informative. I was wondering, at the end of your presentation, you said that a no treaty is better than a bad treaty. No, I mean, I'm not asking this question just for the sake of asking it, but what is the solution then? Because all the developing countries eventually are getting into this race to the bottom to sign the treaties. So what solution do you see?
Thank you. Is that Mohit from JNU, is it? Okay, thank you. From JNU, India. Any questions, any other questions around the room for Dan or Arjun, who's already got a list of 7 questions, so any other burning questions in the room? Okay, yes, please.
My name is Andres, and I'm from Colombia. That's probably about right. I just got a question for Teresa. Really interesting research. And I noticed that you put a graph towards the end of your presentation about the moments in which legislation was relieved to a certain extent on taxation and when it was actually tightened up. Looking at that graph, it appeared to me, just very, very quickly, that it happened sort of in the periods of like mid-90s to late 90s and then mid-noughties to late noughties, which we have some of the last 2 really deep recessions. So to me, it looks a bit like perhaps there is a political element of this in relation to national policies to taxations, as when things are going up and things get on the wrong way, and then there's some more protectionist approach to taxation and income of the country and raise funds. So has this sort of element of that external factor of politics been looked into any research or your particular research?
Thank you very much. Thank you for all those questions. I'm going to now throw the questions back at you again, just so that we can group questions. We have only about 17 minutes left because I've been warned that I will be shut down at 10:35. So can we start with you, Teresa, with the question which came from online or from Slido, which is the arm's length principle still the underlying norm for transfer pricing regulations in the BEPS discussion?
Thank you. Thank you for all the questions. Yes, actually, just in 2017, OECD published a new OECD transfer pricing report, which were including some of the also already discussed things under the BEPS. And the arm's length principle is still the underlying and the most important principle we use in transfer pricing to set the prices between unrelated parties.
Thank you. Can people hear me? Okay. Thanks. I'm not sure if that's my loud voice or. Okay. the next question is for Lucas, which is, can you control for the downward trend in withholding tax rates? For example, a 10% rate in 1975 is a more aggressive policy decision than one in 2015.
This research is kind of like a snapshot of like the current current environment in terms of double tax treaty. So we cannot do like a historical analysis, but if we collect for each of the treaties a date, then it would be easy to have kind of like a dynamic view of the aggressiveness of each treaty for further research maybe.
Thank you. It seems a bit stilted because this is the first time I'm using Slido. I've never used an online tool before. So I'm trying to ask questions, presumably in the voice of whoever it is who was trying to pose the question in the first place. So I apologize if this seems a bit strange. The third question is also from online, and I will come back to the questions you've posed in the room. So just to make sure all the speakers get a chance to add some comment. This is a question for Arjun, which is, assuming that African countries act rationally, they should get some advantage too from agreeing to lower withholding tax rates. What could that benefit be? And this is I presume it's some kind of economist asking this question? Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah, sorry, give me 1 second. I am not sure whether this question is.
Oh, I beg your pardon. Sorry, the question was for Lucas.
So the question was like if it would be beneficial for African countries to homogeneously lower withholding taxes. No? So bribes, for example, or bad or unclear assumptions in the calculation. For example, you have like in a treaty negotiations 2 stages. In the middle there is like lobbying. There are some people. One said, well, like if we had a treaty, maybe we could do this very a big investment, blah blah, and then you have someone like in the team that does kind of like a rough estimate of like the revenue, and then like the decision is taken. And what research by Martin Hearson, which I don't know if he's in the room, but he will be presenting that there is very often like striking asymmetries between the negotiating teams of countries. So maybe like the estimates of like revenue loss or overall economic well-being can be very different in their truthfulness, depending on the skills of each negotiating team, which can be either like an army of like economists and tax lawyers, or just the Minister of Finance and an intern.
Thank you. Sorry again, Arjun. I have 2 questions for you, which I'm going to try and pose together because I understand one is going to be a short answer and one is going to be a slightly longer answer. So one of the questions is, have you looked at how these clusters have changed over time and if corporations have moved a lot after a particular rule change? And the other question is about about Germany and France and why they are not adapting the certain types of FDI projects, or all the 5 types. So are you happy to answer both? I can see Javier nodding his head in the background, so I'll try and get back to you to offer a comment if you'd like to once.
All right, yeah, thank you for these great questions. maybe before I answer them very briefly, because I saw there was one question about the data that we used, and it was a good question because I forgot to mention this. So we used two sets of data. One group, one set of data sources, which we use for the macro institutional indicators and the tax indicators. We draw from Eurostat, World Bank, Open Data, International Bureau of Fiscal Documentation, and the UNCTAD. And then we used data from Orbis for the micro level, so the firm level data that we used. But yeah, you can find more detail in the paper. The question. So the first one was whether we looked at change over time. The answer to that is simply no. We used an average of the last 12 years. Yeah, I'm not sure about the detail, but you can see that in the paper. And no, so we have not looked at how these clusters change over time. Would be very interesting if someone would like to do research on that. The second question, Germany and France. Yeah, well, let me start by emphasizing that. So we looked at the extent to which countries are successful in attracting these types of FDI relative to their GDP and also relative to other countries. So it doesn't mean that Germany and France are not attracting FDI. It means, so our findings mean that Germany and France are not as successful relative to what you would expect these countries based on their GDP to attract these specific types of FDI as compared, for example, to the countries in the different clusters that are successful. Yeah, and then one, I think, very interesting question. To what extent... Oh. These two, yeah. Okay, yeah. Then... and ideas why? No, this is, as I mentioned earlier, I think there's a political economy story behind this. So why France and Germany are not successful, which is another interesting avenue for future research.
I think for both those questions, what I'm going to do in the comments section is to invite people to conjecture from the floor in terms of why Germany and France are not attracting it, and what in terms of Africa, what is the rational reason why they might choose to still engage in these agreements, because I assume there will be some commentary from the experts on the floor. I'd like to take one final question to Dan, which is not the data question which was asked of you, but a question about, with respect to outbound FDI from China, how much of it is state-owned firms and how much is round-tripping via conventional FDI?
So you mean outbound? Oh, so I mean outbound. I mean, so what I've looked at basically is specifically the percentage coming in from Hong Kong. What percentage of that belongs to state-owned companies according to a narrow definition of majority state ownership? Keeping in mind the data in Orbis is pretty sketchy for China in general, and the definition of a state-owned firm in China is a gray area. So the figure I have is, it looks like more than half of what I could find in Orbis is state-owned companies according to a narrow definition of what's coming in through Hong Kong. I haven't added up an outbound figure for China, but my sense is it looks like possibly even more if you look at the Chinese offshore investments in other countries would be state-owned MNEs. It's difficult to get a round-tripping figure for state ownership for China as a whole, basically because the data for BVI is so terrible, it's difficult to draw many conclusions about the micro level there, so that's why I've limited that to Hong Kong. But it's clearly like a very large percentage. But I mean, it would depend on how exactly you define a state-owned firm, and then taking into account these big confidence bands from the Orbis data issues.
There is another question for you, Dan, which has come through, which is, how does the world's FDI map look like if you remove the effects of round-tripping? I think that's quite an interesting question.
Well, I mean, that's one thing you can do with this. I would need to go back and look at the tables for the sort of, I mean, it would look pretty boring. You'd basically see the United States would be huge, and then Japan, and then like some other place. If you look at just the offshore investment component and strip out round-tripping, there's one figure further back that showed that basically the United States is way out ahead of everyone else in terms of non-round-trip offshore investment. Then the UK is in second place. And then interestingly, third place, they actually have Taiwan. for non-round trip FDI, but that's this sort of highly uncertain estimate for how much is invested in mainland China. So in terms of the offshore component of non-round trip, that's what I have at the moment.
Thank you. Atul, your question, I have certainly got it. I wasn't actually sure which of the speakers you wanted to pose it to, because it's quite a broad question that might actually be useful for the audience to consider as well. So Atul's question is around, what does all this deliberate complexity mean for the theory of the firm? So could I ask, actually, instead of putting the panel on the spot, could I put Ronan on the spot, Ronan Palan? Because I believe Atul was trying to direct the question to you, and he was signaling. Oh, it was, okay, I beg your pardon. I can't ask you the question, no. Well, in which, it says Atul Shah here, and I thought he was trying to trick you. And I was always willing to be complicit. But in that case, is there anybody around the room who would like to have a first comment on this question, and then to give the panel a little bit of a chance to respond as well?
I can give it a shot. I do think this is a this is an excellent question, and I'm not going to pretend to have the full answer to it. But one thing I do think is that much of the theory, I mean, if you think about the firm as a fragmented corporate group rather than a specific entity, then much of the existing theory of the firm, as it exists in economics, focuses very much on, I would suggest, focuses very much on the top holding company and its relationship to shareholders. But what is forgotten is the whole sort of what's happening under the surface, which is that the firm is much more than just this top entity. So this is how I think of a very preliminary answer to your rather challenging question.
I think Sol has a... Sol, did you have a comment on this or a different question?
The firm grows because of its how far it can outcompete others by internalizing activities as opposed to doing them through markets transactionally. But that's generally focused on real activities. I think increasingly theorists of transnational corporations are focused also on the regulatory arbitrage, particularly for transnational corporations, that they've been able to grow not only by combining the advantages of location in different places, but also combining regulatory arbitrage, where I think tax avoidance is very key. And that has led to financialization of the firm. So I think those are very important lines of research.
That was Sol Picciotto, Lancaster University. This is Ronan Palan.
Yeah, if I can say some words about it, and I think these are really preliminary thoughts of mine, basis of research that I think Atul referred to and Arjan. I'm beginning to be more convinced that we are slightly tax avoidance biased. We are slightly tax avoidance biased. For good reasons. We are suspicious of the world out there, and we're suspicious. But I think we tend to undermine, we all mention, and I think some of the presenters did mention risks, that corporations or firms are very much influenced. Risk is a very important aspect. But it's mentioned, but it's never taken into account. Many of those structures that Arjan described, or not, you didn't describe structures, but you described the effect of those structures. And a lot of the data, I think, that Dan described has also to do, which the implication is this huge flow of FDI must imply in some form or another tax avoidance, okay? I think quite a lot of it has to do, but I don't know how much, with either internal risks in the firm, i.e. try to limit liability within, okay? Or in the case of China, for example, political risks and others, okay? And I think the data that we do have, all these flows that we do see, combine the two, and it's very difficult at the moment to differentiate. So I begin to, I don't have evidence for that, okay? But I begin to suspect that we have here, for example, for this panel, kind of a tax bias. That doesn't mean there's not a lot of tax avoidance going on, but perhaps the figures are slightly biased upward for what I think they might be because of these risks.
Thank you for that. Thank you also for bearing with us while we ploughed through a variety of questions. I realize your question up here, your two questions up here are not yet answered, and we'll try and get some commentary from the room in a second. But just to pull back some of the discussions, because sometimes having these random questions on 4 different papers, whether you remember Arjun's paper as the one with the kind of bacterial infection on a petri dish kind, the beautiful design, or the geography. It's hard to separate these things. But I'd like to bring our focus back to something that Richard Murphy wrote about a little while ago, about the purpose of taxation. And I think I'd like to bring that back, because in terms of today's conference and tomorrow's, the discussions in this room have been about monetary policy, fiscal policy, and also about financial regulation and regulatory arbitrage on the surface. But more generally, they've not yet been about how we reorganize the economy, how we redistribute income and wealth. And I think those are topics for discussion tomorrow. It would also be interesting to think about the repricing of goods and services and raising representation in a democracy, because in terms of taxation as a tool to achieve that, those are things that are coming to the heart of your questions, I think, really. So I'd like to urge you all to offer any comments now on any of those topics, if I may, because those are kind of left off the discussion, although Sol brought up the regulatory arbitrage point, and Ronan, the relation to risk and the theory of the firm. So could I? Thank you. Could I just quickly ask if there are any comments in relation to those things, or any responses to the 2 questions, which were very broad questions and hopefully will be covered through the next 2 days. Any other comments that the panel wishes to make, or anybody in the audience wishes to make?
Yeah, Ronan, I think you are very right about this. But I also think at the same time that the distribution of risks and how sort of the management of risks through routing, FDI, through holding companies, is very much linked up with tax avoidance through transfer pricing regulations. Because transfer pricing regulations are sort of based on how are risks distributed between subsidiaries, and based on that, the taxing rights are divided between these subsidiaries. So I just wanted to mention that I think risks and tax planning are very much interrelated.
I think this also, Ronan, comes back to the question of risk to whom. Because if you come back to many of the questions about risk in relation to the firm, we think of risk in relation to risk to potentially stockholders, many of whom don't own the stock for any reasonable length of time and don't have the ability to control where that is going. We also think of risks to civil society in terms of the citizens who are affected, not just by tax being concentrated to some forms of activity which are hugely detrimental to the economy, but also through no investment in R&D as a result of, for example, of money being put into offshore structures, which then are reinvested in those offshore structures so as not to recoup the tax back, or not to be able to pay tax in the home country, for example, from the US. So I think there are risks to the domestic economy, for example, in the US, which are not mentioned anywhere. There are risks to civil society and other groups, which, in terms of undermining democracy, in terms of how powerful these players get when they are able to engage in TTIP-style deliberations, which will cut out national negotiators and undermine any sense of transparency or proper disclosure, and limit citizen engagement with that. So I'm hoping, although these questions are fairly broad, they will get covered through the day. I'm reluctant to expect to answer them all in one session on FDI, although this offers us a kind of geographic as well as a very specific regional perspective in certain countries in terms of how FDI is evolving. And of course, more generally, I think the theme of financialization and how it is being justified and how the narrative is being changed in relation to how, whether this is, in terms of the narrative in relation to risk, or in terms of what is acceptable as for firms to do in order to be efficient, or whether we judge rate of return as the appropriate incentive or rational action as the appropriate way of behavior in which we judge what these firms will do in relation to regulation or how regulators will act.